Alright, Senate ranking number 6. After this video's done, we'll have 3 more videos to go. And they finally evened out, so now each of the following ones will be top 11s. Just like the video that started it all. And while I'm not using the tier list format, I do have a tier list in the description of the senators that I have made and put in these videos thus far, just in case you guys want to give me your rankings of them. And that's probably the format that I'm going to use when I inevitably have to re-rank them all. But before we get into the list proper, here are some ground rules for each of the lists. 1. The lists are basically self-contained. Basically the only thing that we can guarantee in this video is that number 1 on this list is better than number 10 on this list. It's also the same reason why I'm doing it through a top 11 and not literally giving the actual numbers. But just so we're clear, here are the numbers that are on this list, and here are the numbers that they mean in the broader list. 2. For these lists, we'll be focusing on their tenures in the Senate rather than any other office they held. I might mention a little bit about if they were in the House, I might mention a little bit of that or a little bit of their other broader political career. I mean, at this point, these videos are basically just an excuse to make a bunch of tiny versions of who is videos. But broadly, I want to focus on the things they actually did in the Senate. 3. If any, incumbents are going to be left to a bare minimum because, frankly, it's really hard to rank incumbents. In fact, the only reason why I even made it a top 11 list in the first place was because the number 1 was an incumbent, and I felt that it was too much of an unfair advantage, especially if you've watched this channel at this point. Speaking of, the last one, number 4, being that this is obviously going to be my opinion. I've gotten a decent number of people who have given comments to say, what about this senator, what about this one? And sometimes I have to just blanketly tell them, sorry, I don't like this person that you said. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, but I also have some broad ideas of who I want to put in the future lists, so there's a good chance that even if you do suggest a senator, unless there's a very big reason why they should be included, there's a good chance they probably won't be. Alright, so here are a top 11 even more best senators, in my opinion. Number 11, Lowell P. Weicker. A person who keeps getting requested to be in one of these videos. And I put him on the list to possibly be reviewed later, and sure enough, it's finally time for me to figure out what the heck he did that earns him all this love from people who probably shouldn't love him. Weicker was originally a loyal Republican to his party, but as the party would shift to the right, he would begin to butt heads with the party leaders, starting with opposition with Nixon, to the point where he'd be flipped off every time he would leave public. But after Watergate, his state rewarded him for being right with 2 more terms. His criticism of the party's conservative wing maintained during the Reagan administration, supporting Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the Civil Rights Restoration Act in 1987, and opposing 2 of Reagan's SCOTUS appointments. However, his top priority was seemingly advocating for the rights of the disabled, leading a Senate committee on the... It was a different time, guys. It was a different time. Hey, and remember, this committee was created with the intention of putting forth a bill that could actually help the disabled community. So, does he get the pass, guys? However, conservatives were mad that they were getting nothing done with him around. So, they would end up finding someone to be their pet. Which... yeah, the contrast with the modern-day Republican Party is obviously very noticeable, but you can clearly tell why I waited a little while to put him on a list. Good, but not really too notably great. Maybe his fanboys will prove me wrong in the comment section. Number 10, Joseph S. Clark Jr., a liberal senator from Pennsylvania. Remember when we used to have those? Anyways, Clark was best known for his advocacy for societal reform. First, on a lot of social issues like civil rights and gun control, and also via passing bills like the Manpower Development and Training Act, which was a jobs training program. But it wasn't until he became the head of the Democratic Steering Committee that he realized there was something else that needed reform. As he tried to do his job and make certain appointments, he was threatened by conservative Democrats who used their Senate seniority and the filibuster to stop him, which led him to dub the Senate a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Something that we should probably look into nowadays. but unfortunately there wasn't much else really that notable about him. Number 9, Clarence Dill. Dill was a very noted progressive since his term in the US House, being one of the 50 representatives to oppose World War I, with his Senate run being prompted because the incumbent progressive had shifted away from it due to Wilson's wartime policies. Dill would be painted as a political radical due to his support for something called the Plum Plan, which was an idea that sought to turn railroad companies into worker co-ops, which would merge into one publicly owned company. See, a weird thing that you learn when you look up a ton of old-timey politics is that a bunch of prominent people just openly started these weirdly somewhat radical political organizations, usually focused on one specific thing. The most well-known that you all probably know is the Share Our Wealth program. But back to Dill, while he unfortunately didn't really get to do anything regarding the Plum Plan, in the Senate, he decided to focus his attention on the regulation of the budding radio industry, sponsoring the 1927 Radio Act, which made the Federal Radio Commission, and the Communications Act of 1934, which merged it into the FCC. Similarly, good, but not that great. Trust me, as this list goes on, things start picking up. Number 8, Charles Mathias. Mathias was elected under a platform that a Republican could never get elected on today, opposing war and fighting crime by reducing poverty, pushing multiple bills that would end US involvement in Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia. Mathias was extremely critical of the GOP's shift towards racism via the Southern Strategy, and would further expand his critiques towards the Nixon administration in general,
being one of the earliest to call for a Watergate investigation.
One issue that Mathias was very passionate about was campaign finance reform, refusing any contribution over $100 to avoid the curse of big money that has led to so much trouble. A very standard liberal Republican of the time period, but still very notable nonetheless. Number 7, Bronson M. Cutting, a progressive Republican from the 1930s. Cutting was very notable for reaching across the aisle with Roosevelt, a friend of his he endorsed over his own party. Cutting introduced one of the first bills to give the Philippines independence, but due to certain provisions with it regarding tariffs, the Filipino Senate rejected it. Speaking of, while he seemed generally supportive of tariffs for domestic gain, he was vehemently opposed to the weaponization of tariffs, as the US government had a loophole in Section 305 that allowed them the ability to use the tariffs to completely ban certain obscene materials from entering the United States, which he denounced as irrational, unsound, and un-American. Cutting was also known for his support of something called the Chicago Plan, which would have eliminated the process of fractional reserve banking by forcing banks to only give out what they had, thereby preventing another Great Depression, which was caused by excessive private lending. Another thing that we sorely need in the Senate, someone who's willing to look at past mistakes and actually wants to learn from them. Number 6, Robert Latham Owen, the second open Native American member of the Senate. Owen was active in many progressive causes in the time period. While he was a lot more aligned with the Woodrow Wilson style of progressivism, even in supporting World War I, he also supported and spearheaded the actual good causes of the era, like the direct election of senators and women's suffrage. He led the effort to end child labor in the United States, passing a bill to do so, which unfortunately got overturned by the Supreme Court. But he was most well known for being the guy who created the Federal Reserve. Wait, don't leave. Like, he didn't just make the Federal Reserve. What he was trying to do with the creation of the Federal Reserve was that he was trying to make it a force for good,
trying to fight
the potential of the Federal Reserve being used as a tool for the big banks to basically get their way. However, the best he was able to accomplish was having them not completely control the Federal Reserve, which even Owen acknowledging that the final bill wasn't exactly what he had in mind when creating the Federal Reserve in the first place. In that case, you could probably argue that he should be a little lower on the list because of it, but maybe the rest of the generic good stuff he did drags him up. Number 5, Ted Kennedy, the lesser-known third brother. Ted didn't suffer the fate of his more famous family members, so he had a chance to become a mainstream Democrat. for better and for worse. He opposed the Bush-era's foreign policy, was an early supporter of gay marriage rights, was a pretty notable environmentalist, and was a pretty loud advocate for the United States adopting a universal healthcare model, which he dubbed the cause of my life. He's also arguably one of the most successful people on many of these lists, being attributed to the passage of a lot of bills, including but not limited to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the COBRA health insurance provision, the creation of CHIP, the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, and the Ryan White's AIDS Care Act. I mean, he does get dragged down by a lot of the other elements of his normie Democrat behavior, and the not-so-nice elements of being a Kennedy, but denying the positives that he did wouldn't really be worth the hassle. Number 4. William H. Seward. Seward was one of the leading abolitionist senators of the time period, even to the point where during his Senate tenure, his household was used as a safe house for slaves during the Underground Railroad, with the excuse being that he was too busy in the Senate to know what his wife was up to. Sure, buddy. Other things that are of obvious note are Seward opposing the pro-slavery elements of the Compromise of 1850 and being a vehement opponent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Seward was prominent, but also pretty radical, even to the point of saying that slavery's potential abolition, quote, "whether that consummation shall be allowed to take effect with needful and wise precautions against sudden change and disaster, or be hurried on by violence, is all that remains for you to decide." Because every single abolitionist in the United States was trying their best to resolve things in a peaceful, non-violent manner. It was the reactionaries' inability to process change that led to the situation that happened. No wonder someone like Seward was chosen to be a member of the cabinet. Number 3. Lyman Trumbull. Trumbull was one of the leading anti-slavery Democrats. You know, it's actually funny. You don't really hear that term a lot when it comes to history. Something that even Trumbull noticed during his tenure because he flipped parties a lot because of his anti-slavery stance. Trumbull was sort of a strange, unsung, yet somehow notable figure from this entire time period in US politics, being in a somewhat advisory role to Lincoln, which put him solidly anti-slavery, but not necessarily one of the radicals. Very unfortunate. Trumbull was best known for being the chief sponsor of 3 notable bills: the Confiscation Act of 1861, a bill that would allow the US government to seize all property used to fight against the Union in the Civil War, the Freedmen Bureau Act of 1866, a bill that would have given abandoned land to freed men, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which sought to explicitly define US citizenship to include freed slaves, and when the latter was vetoed by President Johnson, he would respond with, "If the bill now before us cannot be passed, then the constitutional amendment proclaiming freedom to all inhabitants of the land is a cheat and a delusion." Perhaps that might have led to Trumbull starting to get radicalized. I mean, he did inevitably become a member of the People's Party of the United States and would serve in an advisory role to Eugene V. Debs when he was sentenced to jail. Just something to speculate about. Number 2. Ralph Yarborough. Seeing that he's a senator from Texas, you're probably thinking, and yes, he did manage to sum up his entire political philosophy into a little folksy quote. That quote being, "Let's put the jam on the lower shelf so the little people can reach it." A sentiment that he maintained during his entire political career. Yarborough's first accomplishment was to prevent the guy who accused Shirley Temple of being a communist to get a seat in the Senate. But in a legislative sense, his first accomplishment was pushing for federal aid to universities, but Yarborough would become a lot more prominent in regards to his support for civil rights legislation, being the only senator that came from a state in the short-lived fake country phase to vote for all the civil rights legislation at the time period, even having a funny incident where him and Strom Thurmond began fighting on the Senate floor because Strom tried to block him from voting for an anti-segregation governor to become the Community Relations Service director. And given his political leanings, he was of course originally very supportive of Lyndon B. Johnson, but only on the domestic policy. Once the foreign policy started rearing its head, he started shifting away from the administration. So what I'm hearing is Kennedy picked the wrong Texan to be his VP. And to wrap up this list, number 1, John Conness. Now I know what you guys might be thinking. Why this guy of all the possible senators in this list? I mean, yeah, he's an abolitionist senator during the Civil War era, but he's not the first one on this list. What puts him above all the rest on this list? Well, the issue that drives him to the top of this list is an issue that we have been seeing a lot talked about today, especially considering the dialogue surrounding this issue not necessarily being the best. The issue in question being immigration, with John Conness being one of the earliest and loudest advocates for the rights of immigrants, despite its massive unpopularity. You see, in the immediate post-war of America, with the big issue seemingly solved, a lot of people wanted to shift to another big issue, another big cause to rally behind. Study American history and you'll notice that there were a lot more movements that started growing out of the post-Civil War America. Women's suffrage, prohibition, populism, heck, even socialism started getting prominent in this era. And some people, especially in the state of California, focused their attention on the quote-unquote issue of immigration, particularly Chinese immigration, because they were the first major group of immigrants in America that people had a problem with. I wonder why. And the thing is, this wasn't really a one-sided issue. People from all across the political spectrum were opposed to Chinese immigration. Even people who themselves were immigrants were denouncing Chinese immigrants because they weren't the right kind. And Conness was not having any of this rhetoric, and was one of the few voices to speak in favor of Chinese immigration, despite its unpopularity in his home state. Even getting into a heated exchange when the topic came up in a debate regarding the possible ratification of the 14th Amendment, which dealt with the subject of birthright citizenship, particularly for former slaves, with one senator trying his best to argue that the bill could exclude the children of immigrants born here, which Conness immediately rebuked by saying, "We are entirely ready to accept the provision proposed in this constitutional amendment that the children begotten of Chinese parents in California shall be citizens." You know, because said amendment very explicitly says in its first sentence, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." And that is why I think he deserves this top spot. Because not only did he literally just point blank solve the issue in the most clearest cut explanation that nobody who is actually serious about the laws of this nation should be disputing, but also just shows how this has always been an issue, how reactionaries have always felt the need to fight against change, fight against progress, to the point where they will literally rehash arguments that have already been made and resolved years ago, because they have nothing outside of whining about possible change. So yeah, 67 down, 33 more to go. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you want more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.